He wasn't supposed to survive. Beneath 6 inches of fractured ice, where the glacier whispered like something ancient and unforgiving, a German shepherd lay suspended between breath and silence, his body barely moving, his eyes still open. The wind carved across the frozen expanse in long, hollow cries, dragging needles of snow across the surface like time itself trying to erase what remained. No tracks. No voices. Just a white world that didn't care if anything lived or died within it. And then there was Ethan Cole. 38. Former U.S. Marine. A man who had once known direction, purpose, brotherhood. Now just another figure standing at the edge of something cold enough to make memory feel distant. His boots stopped inches from the cracked sheet of ice, breath rising in slow, visible clouds. He didn't come here looking for anything. Not redemption. Not meaning. Just quiet. But quiet has a way of breaking when something refuses to disappear. At first, it was just a sound. Faint. Out of place. A soft scraping beneath the ice, like something still trying to hold on. Ethan narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, crouching low, gloved hand brushing away powdery snow. And then he saw it. Eyes. Amber. Steady. Not wild. Not afraid. Just there. Watching him. The dog didn't thrash. Didn't bark. It simply looked at him through the distorted layer of ice, chest rising barely enough to prove life hadn't left yet. Something about that stillness hit deeper than any cry for help ever could. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, a flicker of something old and familiar moving through him. Not instinct. Not training. Something quieter. Something heavier. He scanned the horizon once. Nothing but endless white stretching for miles. No help was coming. No one would know if he turned away. The wind pressed harder against his back, urging him to leave, to survive, to choose the living over the dying. His eyes dropped back to the dog. Still watching. Still holding on. Time slowed in that space between decision and action. His breath steadied. His shoulders squared. And then, without another thought, Ethan stepped onto the ice. It groaned beneath his weight, a deep, warning sound. That echoed through the frozen sheet. He didn't stop. Each step measured. Controlled. Until the crack widened beneath him, spidering outward like a fracture in glass. And then it gave. The world disappeared in an instant. The ice broke open with a hollow snap, swallowing him into water so cold it felt like it erased everything above it. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, lungs tightening, muscles seizing as the glacier wrapped around him like a grip that didn't intend to let go. For a moment, there was nothing but pressure and silence. And then, movement. The dog. Just beneath him, drifting, fading. Ethan forced his arms forward, fingers numb already, reaching through water that resisted every inch. His hand brushed fur. Then again. And this time, he caught hold. The weight was lighter than expected. Too light. He pulled, every motion slower than it should have been, dragging the animal upward toward the jagged break in the ice. The surface felt impossibly far away. His chest burned, his vision narrowing, but he didn't let go. Not now. Not after finding something that still chose to fight. The wind greeted him again as he broke through, hauling the dog onto the fractured ice with a strength he didn't know he had left. Both of them lay there for a second. Still. Silent. Steam rising faintly from soaked fabric and matted fur. Ethan rolled to his side, coughing, dragging in air like it mattered again. His eyes turned to the dog. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. He pressed a shaking hand against the animal's side, waiting. Nothing. His jaw clenched. No, he muttered under his breath, voice rough, barely there. Don't you do that. His hand remained. Seconds stretched. The wind howled. And then, a tremor. Small. Almost nothing. But enough. Enough to stop the world from going quiet again. The tremor was weak, almost imaginary, but Ethan felt it beneath his palm like a whisper refusing to fade, and he leaned closer, his breath unsteady, his body still shaking from the cold that clung to his bones, the kind of cold that did not just touch the skin but settled deep inside, slow and patient, waiting to take more than warmth, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in relief, but in focus, the way he had learned years ago when everything depended on noticing the smallest sign that life had not given up yet, and when he opened them again, his hand remained steady against the dog's side, counting, waiting, believing in something he could not explain, and then it came again, another faint movement, shallow but real, and his jaw tightened as something shifted inside him, something he had buried long ago beneath silence and routine and the weight of memories he never spoke out loud. "That is it," he murmured, voice low, controlled, like he was speaking to more than just the animal, like he was reminding himself that survival did not have to be loud to be real, and he moved quickly then, not rushed, but precise, sliding his arms beneath the dog's body, feeling how light it was, too light, ribs faint beneath soaked fur, the kind of weight that told a story without words, and he pulled him closer, shielding him from the wind with his own body, pressing warmth into something that barely had any left, the glacier stretching around them in every direction, endless and indifferent, but no longer empty, not now, not with this fragile, stubborn life between them, and Ethan pushed himself to his feet, legs unsteady at first, boots slipping slightly against the fractured ice before finding hold, and every step back toward solid ground felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what he carried, not just the dog, but the choice he had already made without saying it out loud, and when he finally reached the snow-covered bank, he lowered himself down carefully, keeping the dog close, one hand still pressed against his side, still counting, still waiting, and the wind softened slightly here, blocked just enough by the uneven terrain to give them a pocket of quiet, a place where the world did not feel so vast and empty, and Ethan shrugged off his outer jacket despite the cold biting instantly through his soaked clothes, wrapping it around the dog with slow, deliberate care, tucking it close as if that simple act could hold everything together, and for a moment he just sat there, breathing, watching, listening, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears, and then the dog's chest rose again, barely, but enough to be seen, enough to matter, and Ethan exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering slightly as something unfamiliar settled in his chest, not relief, not yet, but something close to it, something quieter, and his eyes drifted to the dog's neck, to the faint outline beneath the wet fur, something metallic catching the dull grey light, and he hesitated for just a second before brushing the fur aside with careful fingers, revealing a collar worn but intact, and attached to it, a tag, not the standard kind he had seen 100 times before, not military issue, not civilian either, something in between, something that did not belong out here, and he turned it slightly, squinting through the cold haze in his vision, trying to make out the markings, the numbers etched into its surface. Unfamiliar, deliberate, and for the first time since he stepped onto the ice, the silence around him felt different, not empty, but watching, like the glacier itself had been holding more than just the cold, and Ethan's gaze lifted slowly to the horizon again, scanning the endless white, no movement, no sound, and yet something in his gut shifted, the same quiet instinct that had once kept him alive when things did not add up, when something felt wrong before it could be seen. And his hand tightened slightly around the edge of the jacket, wrapped around the dog, pulling it closer, as if that alone could keep whatever this was from reaching them. And under the fading grey sky, with the wind carrying nothing but distant echoes, Ethan Cole sat beside a life that should have ended, holding on to a question that had just begun. The numbers on the tag did not follow any pattern Ethan recognized, not military serial, not civilian registry, something deliberately structured yet deliberately hidden, and he turned it slightly between his fingers, brushing away a thin layer of frost that had begun to form, his breath slowing as he studied it with the same quiet focus he once used to read terrain, to read people, to read danger before it arrived, and the dog stirred faintly beneath the jacket, a weak shift of weight that pulled Ethan back from the numbers to the life in front of him, and he adjusted the fabric gently, tucking it closer around the animal's body. "Stay with me," he said again, softer this time, not a command, more like a promise he was not sure he could keep, and the dog's eyes opened slightly, not fully, just enough to catch light, to reflect it back in a dull amber glow that held no panic, no confusion, only exhaustion and something deeper, something steady, something trained, and that was when Ethan knew for certain this was no stray, no lost pet wandering too far. This dog had been taught discipline, taught restraint, taught to endure, and those lessons did not come from nowhere, and he leaned back slightly, scanning the horizon again, slower this time, more deliberate, his senses sharpening despite the cold that still clung to his muscles. The wind had shifted direction. Subtle but noticeable, carrying something different now, not just snow and distance, something faint, mechanical, almost too quiet to be certain, and his eyes narrowed, focusing on a distant ridge where the white seemed just a shade off, just enough to suggest movement where there should have been none, and he held still, listening, counting the space between gusts of wind, waiting for the sound to return, and there it was again, low, steady, not natural, not part of the glacier's voice, something man-made, something controlled, and a familiar tension settled into his shoulders, not fear, but awareness, the kind that never fully left once it had been learned, and his gaze dropped back to the tag in his hand, then to the dog, then back to the ridge, and the pieces did not form a full picture yet, but they did not need to, not when instinct was already speaking clearly enough, and his grip tightened slightly around the jacket as he shifted his position, placing himself more between the dog and the open expanse, subtle, automatic, a movement he did not think about anymore, just did, and the dog's breathing remained shallow but steady, each rise of his chest a quiet defiance against everything that had tried to end it, and Ethan felt that same quiet defiance echo somewhere inside him, something he had not felt in a long time, not since before he started choosing distance over connection, silence over memory, and he exhaled slowly, eyes still locked on the distant ridge, the faint sound growing just enough now to confirm what he already knew. Something was coming, not fast, not loud, but deliberate, like it knew exactly where to go, and he looked down once more at the dog, at the tag, at the fragile life that had somehow pulled him back into a moment that mattered, and without saying it out loud, without even fully admitting it to himself, Ethan made the choice that would carry everything forward. He was not leaving, not now, not with questions still hanging in the air and a life still fighting to stay, and the wind rose again, sweeping across the glacier with a long, hollow cry, but this time it did not feel empty, this time it felt like a warning. The sound grew clearer now, not loud, but steady, cutting through the wind in a way that did not belong to nature, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, rising into a crouch as he kept one hand anchored against the dog's side, feeling the fragile rhythm still holding on, each breath a quiet argument against everything closing in around them, and his eyes stayed locked on the distant ridge where the white blur had begun to take shape, faint at first, then more defined, a dark line moving against the pale horizon, slow, controlled, deliberate, and the realization settled in without panic, only clarity. They were not out here by accident, and neither was the dog, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as something old returned to him, not the noise of battle, not the chaos, but the stillness before it, the discipline of observation, the quiet calculation of what mattered most in the next few minutes. And his gaze dropped briefly to the dog again, to the tag still resting against damp fur, to the numbers that did not belong, and he slid it gently back beneath the jacket, covering it from sight without thinking, a small instinctive act that spoke louder than any decision, and the dog shifted again, a faint sound escaping him, not quite a whine, more like a breath catching against exhaustion, and Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and firm. "Easy," he said, not asking, just grounding, and the dog's eyes flickered open again, meeting his for a brief second, and in that look there was something unmistakable, recognition without knowing, trust without reason, and it settled something inside Ethan that had been unsettled for too long, and he straightened slightly, scanning the terrain around him. The slope behind offered a narrow path down toward a cluster of rock formations, uneven, jagged, but enough to break line of sight if used right, and the distance was not far, maybe 30 yards, but in this cold, carrying the dog, it would feel like miles, and the sound from the ridge grew sharper, no longer a question, now a certainty, something mechanical, something approaching, and Ethan's jaw tightened as he made the calculation he had been avoiding. Staying here meant being found, moving meant risking everything. That was barely holding together, and he looked down again at the dog, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the thin line between survival and loss, and something in him answered before the question fully formed. He adjusted his grip carefully, sliding one arm beneath the dog's chest, the other supporting his hind legs, lifting him with controlled strength, ignoring the immediate protest of his own muscles as the cold bit deeper into his soaked clothes. And he stood, steadying himself for a second before taking the first step, slow, deliberate, each movement measured to keep the dog stable, to keep that fragile breathing uninterrupted, and the wind shifted again, carrying the sound closer now, and Ethan did not look back, not yet. He focused on the rocks ahead, on the path that would give them a chance, however small, and as he moved, the snow compressed beneath his boots with a soft crunch, each step marking a decision that could not be undone, and behind him, the glacier remained silent once more, but it no longer felt empty, it felt watched, and ahead, the narrow shelter of stone waited like a thin line between being seen and disappearing, and Ethan Cole moved toward it without hesitation, carrying more than just a life in his arms, carrying the weight of a choice that had already changed everything. The distance felt longer with every step, not because the rocks were far, but because the cold had begun to settle into Ethan's muscles like weight, slowing him, testing him, and he adjusted his grip again, tightening his hold just enough to keep the dog secure without pressing too hard against the fragile rise of his chest, and the animal let out a faint breath, a soft exhale that brushed against Ethan's wrist, still there, still fighting, and he focused on that rhythm, matching his steps to it. One breath, one step, another breath, another step, keeping it steady, keeping it alive, and the sound behind them grew louder now, no longer distant, the low mechanical hum cutting through the wind in a way that left no doubt. Something was coming over the ridge, something that moved with purpose, and Ethan did not need to see it clearly to understand what that meant. His eyes flicked once toward the horizon, just enough to catch the outline forming against the pale sky, a vehicle, dark, angular, moving slower than speed would allow, as if searching, and his jaw tightened as the quiet instinct inside him sharpened into certainty. They were being tracked, not by chance, not by accident, but by intention, and his gaze snapped forward again to the rocks, closer now, maybe 15 yards, their jagged edges rising unevenly from the snow, casting thin shadows that shifted with the fading light, and he pushed forward, boots sinking deeper with each step, the snow no longer just cold, but resisting, dragging at his legs, demanding more from a body that had already given plenty, and he breathed through it, steady, controlled, refusing to let urgency turn into panic, because panic made mistakes, and mistakes out here did not get second chances, and the dog shifted again, a slight movement of his head against Ethan's arm, his ears twitching faintly as if responding to the same sound that now filled the air, and for a moment their timing aligned, both aware, both present, and Ethan lowered his voice, barely above the wind. "I know," he said, not sure why, but the words came anyway, grounding, steady, and he reached the first edge of the rock formation, stepping behind it quickly but without sudden motion, lowering himself carefully into the narrow space where the wind dropped just enough to feel like silence, and he crouched there, back pressed lightly against cold stone, positioning the dog in front of him, shielded from the open expanse, his hand returning immediately to that steady check against the ribs. Counting, always counting, and the vehicle sound passed along the ridge above, closer now, the hum shifting direction slightly as if scanning, pausing, listening, and Ethan held still, every muscle locked in quiet control, his breath shallow but even, eyes focused on the small opening between the rocks where a thin line of white still showed the outside world, and for a few long seconds, nothing changed, the sound hovered, then moved again, slow, deliberate, circling, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle fully, not just survival now, but concealment, protection, the difference between being seen and staying hidden measured in inches and seconds, and his gaze dropped once more to the dog, to the faint rise of his chest, to the life that had pulled him into this path, and his hand rested there, firm but calm, anchoring both of them to the same quiet truth. They were not done yet, not even close. The hum lingered just beyond the rocks, shifting in slow arcs as if tracing patterns only it understood, and Ethan remained still, his body pressed into the cold stone, one hand anchored against the dog's ribs, counting each fragile rise as if it were the only measure of time that mattered, and the world narrowed to that quiet rhythm, breath in, breath out, hold on, stay here, do not fade. And for a moment the wind softened enough that the mechanical sound stood alone, clearer now, layered with something else, a faint clicking beneath it, precise, methodical, and his eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the cadence of controlled movement, not random, not searching blindly, but scanning with purpose, and the thought settled without panic, only clarity. Whoever was out there knew what they were looking for, and they were not guessing, and Ethan adjusted his position by an inch, just enough to angle his body further between the opening and the dog, his shoulder brushing against the rough surface of the rock, the cold biting through his wet clothing again, but he did not react. He had learned long ago that discomfort could be ignored, but timing could not, and the dog stirred once more, a faint shift of his head against the jacket, his breathing catching slightly before settling again, and Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Easy, you are still here," he said, the words slow, deliberate, meant as much for himself as for the animal, and for a brief second, the dog's eyes opened wider, clearer than before, and they held Ethan's gaze, not with confusion, but with a quiet awareness that did not match the weakness in his body, and then the dog's ears twitched, subtle but sharp, reacting to something outside the narrow space of stone. And Ethan followed that instinct immediately, his eyes shifting toward the thin opening, focusing on the sliver of white where movement might betray itself, and there it was, just for a second, a shadow crossing the ridge above, not large, not fast, but controlled, stopping, starting, pausing as if listening, and Ethan's breathing slowed further, every part of him aligning with that same stillness, matching it, becoming part of it, and he lowered his gaze again briefly to the collar beneath the jacket, to the hidden tag that had started all of this, and his fingers brushed against it through the fabric, feeling the hard edge, the unfamiliar weight, and something in him connected the pieces without needing proof. This dog was not lost, he was removed, and whatever had been done to him was not meant to be found, and yet here they were, hidden beneath rock and wind, holding onto something that should have disappeared, and the sound above shifted again, closer now, then pausing directly overhead, and for a moment everything seemed to stop, the wind, the breath, the world itself holding still, and Ethan did not move, not even to blink, his hand steady against the dog, anchoring both of them to silence, and seconds stretched long enough to feel like something else entirely, until finally, slowly, the sound began to move again, drifting past, not gone, but searching elsewhere, and Ethan allowed a single controlled breath to leave his chest, not relief, not yet, just space, just enough to think beyond the next second, and his eyes dropped once more to the dog, whose breathing, though still weak, had gained a faint steadiness, a rhythm that no longer felt like it might disappear at any moment, and Ethan's hand remained there, firm, present, and in that quiet space between danger and survival, something shifted again, not outside, but within, a recognition that this was no longer just about getting through the cold, or avoiding what moved above them. This was about choosing to carry something forward that others had already decided to erase, and Ethan Cole, without speaking it aloud, without needing to, understood that whatever waited beyond these rocks, whatever truth was buried in that small metal tag, he was no longer willing to walk away from it. The silence that followed did not feel like safety, it felt like a pause, the kind that came before something returned with more certainty, and Ethan remained where he was for a few seconds longer, his body still, his breathing controlled, his senses stretching outward into the frozen space beyond the rocks, listening not just for sound, but for absence, for the subtle shift that told him whether they had truly moved on or simply changed position. And when nothing new came, no hum, no clicking, no shadow crossing the narrow strip of light, he finally allowed himself to move, slowly at first, carefully easing his weight forward, adjusting the jacket around the dog as he did, making sure no part of him was exposed to the wind that still whispered across the glacier like a warning that never fully left, and the dog responded with a faint motion, a small lift of his head that did not last long, but was stronger than before, and Ethan caught it immediately, his hand steadying him, his voice low and calm. "Stay down, you are not there yet," he murmured, not as an order, but as guidance, something gentle layered over the quiet discipline that still defined him, and the dog's eyes opened again, clearer now, holding focus just a moment longer before drifting, but in that moment there was something unmistakable, awareness returning, not fully, but enough to recognize presence, enough to choose not to let go, and Ethan felt it, that shift from surviving to fighting, and it changed something in the air between them, something that no longer felt like chance, but connection, and he adjusted his position again, angling slightly toward the edge of the rocks, careful not to expose himself too quickly, his gaze moving back to the open expanse, scanning the ridge line, the flat white stretch beyond, the faint impressions in the snow where something had passed, tracks too distant to define clearly, but not natural, not random, and he studied them for a moment, his mind working through patterns, timing, direction, until a quiet realization settled in. They had not just come for the dog. They had expected him to be here, or at least something like him. Someone who would notice, someone who would not walk away, and the thought did not bring fear, it brought clarity, and clarity made the next step easier, and Ethan shifted his weight again, preparing to move, not back toward where he came from, but along the lower slope that curved away from the ridge, a longer path, less direct, but hidden from the line of sight above, and he looked down at the dog once more, at the rise and fall that now held a slightly stronger rhythm, at the faint tension returning to muscles that had nearly gone still, and he nodded once, a small motion that carried more meaning than words. "We are not staying here," he said quietly, and the dog's ear twitched in response, a small but deliberate reaction that did not go unnoticed, and Ethan adjusted his grip again, lifting him carefully, feeling the weight shift slightly more solid than before, still fragile, still far from safe, but no longer fading, and he rose from the shelter of the rocks, keeping low, moving with controlled precision as he stepped out into the open again, the wind catching him immediately, colder now as the light began to fade, the sky shifting into deeper tones of grey and blue that stretched endlessly over the glacier, and behind him, the rocks remained still, silent, holding the brief moment of concealment they had offered, but ahead, the path curved downward, narrow, uneven, leading into a stretch of terrain where the white broke into shadow and depth, and Ethan Cole moved into it without hesitation, carrying the dog close, his eyes forward, his senses wide, and somewhere beneath the steady rhythm of his steps, beneath the cold and the silence, there was something else now. Something that had not been there before, not just survival, not just instinct, but purpose, quiet and undeniable, beginning to take shape. The slope narrowed as Ethan moved deeper into the broken terrain, the smooth white of the glacier giving way to uneven ridges and shallow drops where shadow pooled between jagged edges, and each step demanded more attention now, not just for balance, but for silence, because sound carried differently here, echoing in ways that could betray movement if he was careless, and he adjusted his pace accordingly, slower, more deliberate, placing each foot with precision while keeping the dog close against his chest, feeling the steady but fragile rhythm beneath his hand, still there, still holding, and the wind shifted again, colder now as the light faded further, the sky dimming into a muted blue-grey that pressed down over the landscape, flattening distance, making everything feel closer and farther at the same time, and Ethan paused briefly at the edge of a shallow drop, scanning ahead, his eyes tracing the path that curved between two larger rock formations where the terrain dipped low enough to hide them completely from the ridge above, and he moved toward it without hesitation, stepping down carefully, knees bending to absorb the shift, boots crunching softly against packed snow, and the dog stirred again, a slightly stronger movement this time, his head lifting just enough to press faintly against Ethan's arm, and Ethan felt it immediately, a subtle change, small but undeniable, and he glanced down, his voice low and steady. "You are still with me," he said, not asking, not doubting, just stating it like truth, and the dog's eyes opened again, longer this time, focusing, holding, and there was something clearer in them now, not just awareness, but intent, as if some deeper part of him had returned and was beginning to piece together where he was, who he was with, and why he had not been left behind, and Ethan held that gaze for a second, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need explanation, and then the dog's ears twitched sharply, more defined than before, reacting to something distant, and Ethan followed that instinct instantly, his body stilling as his head turned slightly, listening, and there it was again, faint but unmistakable, the mechanical hum returning, not from the ridge this time, but lower, closer to where they had just been, and Ethan's eyes narrowed, recalculating, adjusting, understanding that whatever had been searching had changed direction, closing in, and he shifted his grip again, tightening just enough to secure the dog as he moved forward more quickly now, still controlled, but with urgency threaded beneath each step, the narrow path ahead dipping further into shadow where the light struggled to reach, and he entered it, the temperature dropping another degree as the wind was cut off by the surrounding rock, leaving a heavy stillness in its place, and for a moment, everything felt quieter, almost insulated from the world above, but Ethan knew better than to trust quiet, especially when it came too easily, and he moved deeper, following the natural curve of the terrain until the opening behind them narrowed, partially hidden by the jagged edges that framed it, and only then did he slow, lowering himself carefully to one knee, keeping the dog supported as he adjusted the jacket once more, checking the collar without exposing it fully, feeling the cold metal through the fabric, still there, still unanswered, and he exhaled slowly, eyes lifting toward the narrow strip of sky above, where the fading light hinted at the coming dark, and somewhere beyond that, the faint hum continued, moving, searching, not stopping, and Ethan Cole understood something then with quiet certainty. This was not over, not even close, and whatever had been hidden in that Small piece of metal around the dog's neck was pulling everything toward them, step by step, sound by sound, and he tightened his hold slightly, not in fear but in resolve, because walking away was no longer an option, not after this far, not after choosing to carry a life that someone else had already decided to erase. The darkness began to settle slowly, not all at once, but in layers, soft at first, then deeper, until the edges of the glacier blurred into shadow and the sky above lost its color, leaving only a cold, fading glow that barely touched the surface below, and Ethan remained still for a moment longer within the narrow cover of stone, listening, feeling, measuring the space around him as the world shifted from day into something quieter, something less forgiving, and the dog in his arms moved again. Stronger this time, his breathing no longer a fragile flicker but a steady, if shallow, rhythm that held without breaking, and Ethan lowered his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is it, keep going," he said, the words slow, grounded, carrying a weight that was not just encouragement, but belief, and the dog's eyes opened fully for the first time, amber catching what little light remained, and they fixed on Ethan with a clarity that had not been there before, not confusion, not fear, but recognition, the kind that went deeper than memory, something instinctive, something earned in moments like this where survival was shared, not given, and Ethan held that gaze for a second longer than necessary, something inside him settling into place without needing explanation, and then the sound returned, sharper now in the stillness of the dark, the mechanical hum cutting across the glacier again, closer than before, moving with more certainty, and Ethan's eyes lifted immediately toward the narrow opening above, watching as a faint glow passed across the ridge, a controlled light, scanning, pausing, then moving again, and this time there was no question, they were narrowing the distance, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in acceptance, the kind that came when there were no more variables left to consider, only action, and he adjusted his hold on the dog, pulling him closer against his chest, shielding him fully beneath the jacket, one hand still pressed firmly against his side, grounding himself in that steady rhythm that had brought them this far, and he rose to his feet again, slower this time, conserving energy, every movement deliberate as he turned toward the deeper path ahead, the one that led further away from the open glacier and into terrain that would hide them completely once darkness fully took hold, and he took the first step without hesitation, then another, the snow beneath his boots softer here, less exposed, absorbing sound instead of carrying it, and the wind faded as the rocks closed in, leaving only the quiet of breath and movement, and behind him, the faint glow swept across the ridge once more, searching, persistent, but no longer close enough to matter in the same way, not if he kept moving, not if he stayed ahead of it, and the dog shifted slightly, pressing faintly into Ethan's chest as if aware of the change, and Ethan glanced down briefly, his voice steady. "We are not done yet," he said, not as a warning, but as a promise, and the dog's ear twitched once, a small, deliberate response that carried more strength than before, and Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly, then lifted his gaze forward again, into the deepening shadow where the path curved out of sight, and he moved into it, carrying not just a life that had refused to fade, but a truth that had not yet been spoken, and under the quiet weight of night, with the glacier behind them and the unknown ahead, Ethan Cole did not look back, because some things were not meant to be returned to, only carried forward, one step at a time, until they found their place in the light again.